Bruce Starr Show, but not only a Bruce Starr Show. This is the 80s golden age of comedy series. And the more shows I do, the more exciting it gets, because who knew? And I know Zoe, my guest today, is going to say the same thing. Who knew that this golden age of comedy would live on and on and on and come back at us? I mean, listen, I live on the East Coast. I left show business in 2002, and I miss it terribly. I love the good aspects of it. I love the positive aspects of it. I even went out there twice. I went out there in the 80s during the golden age of comedy when I was a personal appearance agent and manager. I ended up having 35 stand-up comedians at one time. And people say to me, well, who are some of the big stars? Believe it or not, I had Howie Mandel when he was on St. Elsewhere and going on Johnny Carson. And here's something I don't think I talked about. While he was a client of mine working on St. Elsewhere, Johnny used to have him come on the show like once a month, because they realized that every time he came on the show, St. Elsewhere, another NBC show, their ratings went up a point. So it was a perfect situation for NBC and Johnny to have Howie on the show. And it was helping me because Howie would go on the road once or twice a month, someplace different for a weekend in between shooting a St. Elsewhere. And he would be able to promote where he was performing everywhere in the country. And let me tell you something. I don't anticipate getting Howie on the show, but I've got to tell you that Howie is one great guy. He really is. He has been married to the same woman all these years, since the 80s, a guy from Toronto, a super, super guy. But today, I am very, very excited because we're going to have a different kind of show with you. Zoe Friedman is the last name you know, maybe not so much the first name, but Zoe is not a comic. But no one knows more about the 80s golden age of comedy than Zoe Friedman, because Zoe is Bud Friedman's daughter. Welcome to the show, Zoe. So great to have you on the show.
It's nice to see you. You look the same as I remember from 1985.
Well, you look great too. I mean, you've got to show, if you don't mind, you've got to show that picture that you showed me a few minutes ago of you and Bud at the Improv when you were around 14. That's right. When I saw you last. This is great.
This is on my wall, but I took it down. So it is a photo of my dad in the middle, Bud Friedman, and me, the short little round girl, on his left, and my taller sister on his left, on my right. So anyway, Beth and me and my dad at the Improv. You can see the brick wall. We're not quite on the stage, but I think we're in that bar area where there was sort of like pass through a little bit, and my sister's in her satin outfit, which she got for good grades. So yeah, I was probably about 13, 14 there. So that was the era, and when probably we found a corner in the club that didn't have people in it, because at that point it had lots of people in it.
Well, what a phenomenal situation. I mean, your dad leaving Manhattan, leaving the Improv on 44th. If anyone had full reign over the Improv, I mean, Zoe never had to ask permission, but I've got to tell you something, Zoe. Just in the few minutes that we've talked, and your the respect that you give others and others have for you, I've got to tell you that, listen, you had the potential to grow up wild and crazy in the Improv, and you turned out to be a great person. You're doing wonderful work in the world, and that says a great deal about your dad and you.
And my mom.
Yes, absolutely.
She's a parent. And my son. Takes three. Takes a village.
Tell
Yeah.
me, before we go too far
Yeah.
into, my memories and your memories of what went on at the Improv in Hollywood, tell me about your dad and your mom.
So my mom and my dad met in the 60s. My mom was on Broadway. My dad was a producer, let's say wannabe producer, and kind of was what they would call stage door Johnny. I always want to say backdoor Johnny, but that's a whole different thing. Stage door Johnny, and that was kind of the people that met the groupies of the Broadway theater. My mother was a singer on Broadway. She was in How to Succeed and Fiorello and Damn Yankees, sort of the golden age of
Wow.
Broadway, right? Fosse and Sondheim, all that. So they met on I think at Boston Logan Airport, and then kind of he came to the show, Damn Yankees, sold the tickets, the house seats my mom gave him or got him because he couldn't afford it. House seats are just good seats, not free seats. And he didn't go, he sold them and then hung out at the back door, the stage door. And they started hanging out and would go to, Sardi's, or they'd go to Downey's, these places that were institutions in New York, but not really for the chorus person or the every person. Sardi's was like the fancy, Broadway pre-show, post-show stars go there. So this idea, kind of like every idea, it evolved, and it's not so one person. It's a yin and yang, as I like to think about it. Every story of innovation has, at least two people, sometimes one. But in the case of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs is the person that had, and Steve Wozniak's my mom, and I've lived with my mom, growing up when my parents divorced. So I hear both, and the truth is, it was so 1963. This idea sparked my dad, being the go-getter producer. He gets on his moped and he looks for real estate for this kind of coffee house where Broadway stars could let down their hair. An idea that was probably sparked late night after many drinks at Downey's or Sardi's or one of the clubs, where they're like, where the chorus people go? Ding, light bulb. He gets, he rents, soon after finds a Vietnamese restaurant on 44th and 9th. And what was cool is, there were no dedicated comedy clubs, right? It did not exist at the time. Comedy was, Vegas, Atlantic City, dinner clubs, strip clubs. In the 60s, it was the coffee houses all downtown in Greenwich Village. And, Lenny Bruce or even a Pryor might show up, but it was folk music. It was like the Dylan. That was not my parents' scene. They were not hippies and they weren't bohemian, but they were sort of aggressive theater people, right? They were theater folks more than coffee. So they opened this coffee house in Midtown for the theater group versus downtown for the hippies. And not that they have anything wrong with the hippies, but it was a different vibe.
So that people can go down the block after a Broadway performing, singing, dance, so just down the block.
That's right. 44th and 9th and theater district is in the Times Square West 40s. So right, a walk down could be a very cold and windy block, but nonetheless a cold a block or a couple blocks, and people would come after the show and they would eat, they would drink, and then they would get up and perform. And it was
wow.
It was an evolution, which is so interesting that and what I like to say, I feel it was a combination, like other things, of great innovation, right? Something that sparked millions of copycats, including their own, for many, 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 and still this year, till the, modern, it goes on, I should say. And, it evolved into stand-up. And I think part of it was what was happening in the world. If you think about 1963, you think about the world changing. So 64, Kennedy was assassinated. Civil rights movement got signed into law in 1964. Vietnam was happening. Nixon and Watergate. There was all of a sudden, my parents sort of built a soapbox, built it, and they will come. And then the soapbox box ended to be, stood on by comics talking like, and then the role of stand-ups changed, right? Like, so stand-ups were take my wife, please, the mother-in-law jokes, or, people would write for you. And then all of a sudden it evolved into comics being, I think in society, truth tellers, right? Like they would, Yvonne Meader or even David Fry, though those were impressions and they probably weren't so incendiary in terms of what they were skewering. I don't know. I can't speak to it firsthand. It was before my time, but I love that it evolved organically. And I would say that my parents being forward facing people and not people wanting to go back to the 50s, but people who knew, like, who stood against the war. And, they allowed this, these voices, these opinions to come in. And then it became like sort of the truth tellers of like self-reflection, the Richard Lewis's and the, Robert Klein's, the observational, right? And like, it just evolved. And I just love that sort of, it wasn't a comedy club to begin with, it evolved. And truthfully, this is really funny and really true to this day, is my understanding is that the first stand-up comedian at the Improv was a guy named Dave Astor. Now, they used to do improv all the time, even Richard Lewis, and I have some of these photos, which I will get you so we could digitize and put them out there. But you can see here, actually, like this is Richard Pryor.
Wow.
And
Arm wrestling.
Yeah, arm wrestling with Dave Astor, and Ron Carey, who was on Barney Miller, is over there. Oh no, sorry, is over here. Anyway, like, so these were the shenanigans that would happen, right? They would just kind of like get up. There's another Pryor with Dave Astor. So Dave Astor was the first stand-up comic who appeared, and he also happened to like marijuana. And Richard Pryor would go wherever drugs were. And so like it was a natural migration, maybe from uptown, from downtown to midtown, for pot and a stage. And, till, well, you remember, Bruce, I think even in the 80s in LA, there was always music that opened the show, right? Like, oh God, oh God, anyway, we'll get to those names. Anyway, so there was music, there was, and then the music evolved out, and other clubs did not do the music because they didn't have that same kind of affection for how it all started. But I love that story of like how it naturally evolved based on what was happening in time.
I loved learning that Bette Midler was serving and singing.
And singing waitresses, yeah.
In the beginning, before things started evolving, and then other people, maybe not quite as talented, but came in and did the same thing.
Absolutely. Karen Black, who was on Broadway, but like, because there was a music thing, that's right. Bette Midler was one of the early on singing waitresses, and my dad managed her. And,
a good judge of talent, a very good judge of talent.
He is a very good talent. That's right. He did. And I love that when Bette Midler was on Johnny Carson, the second to last show he had before he retired, she told a great story about my dad and he booked her on like the Mike Douglas show or, Merv Griffin show, and her dress split, like, so he had to give her a jacket. Like, it was a great story. And I was like, oh, that's so great that there's those memories. But yeah, there's a lot of history there. And
so then they stopped getting along, I take it, your mom and dad.
Oh yeah, right. I'm not even sure if they ever really got along, like but so the family, we all migrated out to Los Angeles in 75 to open the Los Angeles Club. Chris Albrecht stayed in New York and had a share, bought in, or was given some shares and became the manager. And Chris Albrecht went on to run HBO and Stars, had a few Me Too moments, unfortunately unfortunately or fortunately, if he did the crime, whatever, but he should not be doing stuff. But anyway, I think Al Franken, who was Franken and Davis, they were a comedy duo, performed at the Ash Grove, which was in this space on Melrose, and said they're losing their lease or they're giving it up, called my dad or something, knowing that he was looking. And Jack Knight, who was is an actor, and helped literally physically build the Improv.
Wow.
Also took my mother to the hospital when my sister was coming, because my dad was at the Improv. So Jack Knight took my mom to the hospital. He's a big part of our lives. He was in LA because his wife got cast on Freddie Prince's show. So she played the mail woman. So he was in LA and would go around and look at spaces with my dad. And they found the club and got a crazy 30-year lease or something. And it was a pretty...
it was a rundown area at the time.
That's right. It was a rundown area at the time. And he was also very, able to see, was able to either got a good enough deal that he didn't care about the neighborhood or just kind of saw the progress. And at that point, the Comedy Store was open on Sunset. So, 74, I think, 73. So they were open. So, that West Hollywood area felt like where they would go. So, so the club opened in 75, I think it was. And my whole family moved. And then my parents stopped getting along or got along even less. And I don't think my dad was the best husband to my mom, as he has said. So they divorced. And when the divorce was final, my mom didn't like it out in LA and moved my sister and I back to New York and got the New York Improv in the divorce. And my dad had the LA one and my mom had the New York one, and we moved back to New York. So when we would come out to the club in the 80s, so I was living in New York at the time.
Right.
Summer, spring break. And, it wasn't quite free. When the 80s, when I became a teenager in New York, I would go to the club after Studio 54 with my friends or, Xenon. We would dance. And then we get to have a personal comedy show at 2 a.m, like Mario Cantone or Alan Havey or Dave Attell, the greatest raise, the way to be brought up by a bunch of crazy lunatics. But when I would go back to LA, we didn't, I didn't drive. My dad would go in, we would be left at the house sometimes, which is fine. We were old enough. My cousin Randy was there, but we loved it when we got to go to the club. Loved it. It was just the best. I mean, I would sit in the daytime while he would work and play Pac-Man in the bar on the table game. The table.
I know exactly where it is.
Where it is, right? And sat, and we'd probably come for tapings of evening at the Improv. I think
that was the best.
Oh my God! I think I'm in one of the openings. I think I'm in a line, when they applaud. Yeah, you too, right? Where are residuals, Bruce?
But I got out there in 81.
Right.
So everything was fully going. Everything was, a lot of momentum. And then when I walked into the Improv, and I was introduced to Bruce Smirnoff.
Wow.
And Mark Goldstein.
Oh,
and Barry Martyr. Those are the guys I first got to know, and they were my center guys.
Yeah.
That I stayed friends with. And matter of fact, Bruce lives down here in South Florida.
Yeah.
And see him from time to time, especially when a comedian, Bobby Slayton, comes down, and we end up all going to see him. And
that's nice. I love Bruce Smirnoff. I do think my dad probably bartered babysitting time for stage time. I do think there was some unspoken, because who would want to hang out with my sister, my cousin, and I? We'd go for pizza. Kevin Nealon took us to Knott's Berry Farm. I mean, what?
Wow.
And by the way, got my period for the first time, didn't tell anybody. At Knott's Berry Farm with Kevin Nealon.
Oh.
So anyway,
he's a very nice guy.
He is super nice guy. I don't know if you've seen the Comedy Store documentary.
No, not yet. I'm looking forward to seeing it on Showtime.
I'm about halfway through, but they interviewed Kevin. But what was weird to me is, and this is very Comedy Store, is they're so insular that they have Kevin Nealon talking about his time, not mentioning the Improv where he bartended for how many years. It was so clearly that it's censorship, or it's only us, we're siloed. And I like the people at the Comedy Store, and I like going there when we were allowed to go out, all of that. But that's kind of like, really? You're not going to let him talk about where he also, whatever. Now, it wasn't my documentary to edit, so, but yeah, so yeah, the 80s were interesting because it was also, Bruce, for me, a little like, as a child of divorce, and I was young at the time, so it was raw, like, and it was an ugly divorce. And my mother, although she did a great job parenting, my sister and I didn't do a great job sort of protecting my father, right? Like, in the sense, like, she spewed kind of about their woes, which were their woes, not the woes with being a father, but she was in a lot of pain and whatever. And, I also think now that I have a kid, right? I have a 16-year-old son, like, would I ever move away? I mean, I'm with my husband and I plan to stay with my husband. Like, would I ever take him away from, and look, happy, what do they say? Happy wife, happy life. With my mom, happy mom, happy life, because she wouldn't have been happy out here in LA, where I'm now living for 22 years as an adult. And she's living here with me. She's in my guest house.
Oh my God, how great is that?
Well, I don't know.
Oh, well.
That's a whole nother call. That's a whole nother podcast. I'll show you the book my husband wrote. No. And
maybe she wouldn't mind, not today. Would she mind doing a show?
She would love to do it. And by the way, she's unfiltered in the best way, and she has a frigging great mind. And if you want to hear kind of her tone, listen to Eddie Burke's podcast with her. She did his podcast.
Great.
And she was great. I mean, she, it's a lot calmer. They're not it's many 40 whatever years. So she's not as angry, but she has a great memory and she has a wild perspective on things, right? I mean,
I would be honored.
She would love it.
If she would do a show.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about, the base of the comedy tree.
Yeah.
You've really beautifully filled that in today for me. And having her come on and just letting her talk. I mean, I don't have to say anything, just let her go.
No, trust me, wind her up and she'll go. The other person, I don't know if you read it or whatever, my cousin Randy, funny enough, that's who has all these photos, Bruce. So Randy is my first cousin. So my dad's sister Kayla's daughter, the youngest. She was.
Why isn't she as familiar to me? Didn't she not hang out?
You would recognize her. She came out and visit with us every summer. So she was like sort of our third sister kind of, but she was the photographer. She was a little bit older, and she has photos of her and Bruce Mahler, her and Bruce Smirnoff, her and Robin Williams. She was her and Kevin Nealon. She is like, I bet you, and she has them digitized. I can have her. I know she does, although she's through anyway. Yeah, so we can talk about that offline. But my mother would probably love to do it for sure, and she would give you, because the 80s, the golden age of comedy in LA was crazy. So you'd come to the club, and it was like Seinfeld, Roseanne Barr,
everybody,
and in New York, interestingly enough, it was a golden time in another way. It was very popular. It was definitely a heyday till sort of the decline at the end of the 80s and early 90s. But, there was, New York and LA. So what I was going to say is I was this sort of child of divorce. So it was hard for me probably to be in LA with objectivity, right? I carried my mother's baggage with me, probably not like that you would know it, right? But right. I was kind of like in this, always what's going on and New York versus LA. It was never like they're different. They're there was a lot of competition, but the star and New York comedy scene is always much more about the development of the craft, right? Like, and I thought that LA was always about the showcase of the craft. Right, like, because if you were developing comic, there was no stage time in the 80s anywhere. I mean, they're going to put a starter between Seinfeld and Roseanne Barr and Tim Allen, and the lineup in LA at the Improv in the 80s were star-studded. Not a lot of space for developing comics. Where in New York there was always more of a developing vibe, I think, but it was still a hot time of comedy. But there was such a migration to Los Angeles for the comedy, right? It started when Carson moved in 72, and then the Comedy Store in LA opened, then the Improv and all of that, and then all of a sudden it was this maturation of that time, and, comics getting signed for their Roseanne's and the Seinfelds, right, of all their, their sort of personal stories being created into sitcoms, right? So yeah, it was a wild time, an amazing show. And the star quality, like my biggest one of my biggest for people that I'm fans with is Johnny Carson. Like, I worked at Letterman for 11 years, and it was late night television, what Johnny did that made me even interested. And then seeing Dave Letterman's first morning show, where I was like, oh my God, what is this crazy spin on what I kind of grew up watching. And I remember Johnny being at the club and my dad asking me to get popcorn, right? Like, he was sitting at the bar, and oh my God, and my hand was shaking. I think I gave him about 4 kernels by the time it got there. But like, everybody
I remember him sitting at the bar, and I brought it up
before. Yeah.
At the Improv, and even drinking a little too much.
Probably, yeah, right. I'm sure maybe I wasn't aware of that piece of it, but I'm sure he did. That was what people said he did do, and why not? I mean, the Improv was so incredibly festive. I mean, I was too young to drink at the time, but by and by, when I moved back out here in 2000, you know, I then started hanging out at the Improv like as an adult. So I never got to in LA. I did in New York because I grew up there, and I'd go to the club as a teenager on my own, and then I would go, I managed it or whatever. But yeah, so I you know, it's home. It's a second home. Any Improv with the brick wall, I feel at home. I could breathe easier seeing your brick wall, Bruce.
I put each brick up myself, by the way.
And by the way, you know that famous story, right? That the brick wall at the Improv was solely a function of them not having any money or know-how to cover it up. I don't think that they said, oh, the brick wall is going to be iconic for stand-up. It was a happy accident that has now been, you know, replicated over and over and over again.
Wow.
It's so funny, right?
Isn't that great? So let me ask you,
Yeah.
who let you into their world? Which comics? I know you told me about Kevin, and Kevin's a great guy. He's from Connecticut. He's actually friends with good friends of mine. I know he's a great guy. Who else let you in?
That's a really good question. Well, so Kevin and Bruce Smirnoff, comedic, like, let me think who, you know, I remember like feeling in the LA, since I felt like I was more of a visitor, right? Because I was kind of like, I would come in, you know, like, and these names are, it's not, so like Jeff Kramer. Do you know who Jeff Kramer is?
I don't.
Do you remember Steve Morgan, who was a bartender in LA? That was before your time. So he was an actor. Jeff Kramer was an actor. He was in Jaws. He turned out he was, he's a producer, executive, had a deal at CBS, maybe still does. Really good friends with Marty Nadler, who I know you guys talked about, I can't believe he's a camp counselor.
My sleepaway camp counselor when I was 5 or 6 years old.
Amazing. And I think he's doing all right, but his son does stand up, I think.
I think you're right. I think I heard that.
Anyway, so Jeff and Steve Morgan, because again, like, I guess maybe Steve was a bartender, so I'd go maybe during the day with my dad, and he would let me in. He wasn't a stand-up, he was an actor. You know, comedically, who, you know, I would say like Robin Williams always felt like he let me into his world because he was such not because of this personal thing, but because of what his stand-up looked like, which was, you know, this high energy, frenetic thing that wasn't about like understanding what cunnilingus was. It was he just did zany things. So as a kid, like, his energy and his style comedy, and of course he was Mark from Work. So, right. Like, I also went to his wedding with my dad, and,
oh, wow.
You know, but, and Andy Kaufman, I was very part of, because also his stand-up was so imaginative. It wasn't like that observational, which I like, and now is my, you know, cup of tea. But as a kid, like, who are those people that are breaking through? And Andy Kaufman, I mean, he was.
Did you get a behind the scenes look at Andy at all?
I mean, not
nobody did. Nobody
right.
did, other than you know, one or two people,
right? I don't know, right? He let me into whatever he let me in, and I always felt like I had no awareness that, oh, he's hiding something from me. He was just a really interesting, wild person. He also hosted children's cabaret in New York. So once a month on a Sunday, my parents did children's cabaret, and it was for children's stars from Broadway. So maybe they just did it so I had a stage, because all I wanted to do was perform it when I was a kid, you know? And my sister would play violin, I would stand on my head. And yeah. So anyway, Andy Kaufman would host those children's cabarets. So he would host, and we would get to vote whether he would do it as Mr. Mean, which evolved into Tony Clifton, Elvis, which was his Elvis impression, or Foreign Guy, which evolved into Lock, Gun, Taxi. So I felt very much on the inner world, because he took us bunny hopping around Times Square. He, you know, there was a great childlike quality to him. So I felt very in line with him. But I would say like Richard Belzer I would stand on my head. I did gymnastics all my life, and I would stand on my head, and he and I would stand on our heads and like see who could stand on our heads longer. You know, like I can't believe people were nice to my sister and I. I mean, not because we were nice people, but like, and we the owner's daughter, everybody's kiss ass, so perhaps that was a good part of it. I don't know. By the way, not without being a stand-up, the fact that I've gotten to be on the inside of comedic circles and fly their coattails and not have to contribute in the same way and just like throwing a joke out or razzing somebody is the greatest gift of all, you know, Bruce, right? Like to be in the inner sanctum, but not be the artist that they are. I'm the luckiest person on earth.
I feel the same way, you know, sitting in and even seeing myself in the seats during all those evening at the improvs. I mean, I see myself in about 6 or 8 of them. And again, standing on the sides when the stars would come in. We were at one of the greatest times in show business history.
Yeah.
It's your dad did it, and Mark, and
and Mark too.
They were responsible for this incredible show that went out into the world, and it made my job possible because when the improv started airing, everybody wanted a comedy show in Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and Atlanta and you name the city. And the agents weren't the least bit interested in getting them a $2,000 or $3,000 gig for the weekend. And because I was hanging around with them, and Barry Marta said, "Why don't you book them? No one's booking them. They don't want to book themselves. They hate that."
Yeah.
And it was an easy progression to do that.
Well, and you recognize there was opportunity, there was growth, which is what gives you opportunity. If you're looking, you know where to get the opportunity. It was a really magical time, and it was hot, and stand up was hot. And again, those deals, you know, people, the Roseannes and the, you know, all of those deals that were happening made it a business. So I think until that point, it was not a business. It was, you know, a bar with laughs, or it was a whatever, you know, it was a comedy club, but there was not a business to it. And I would think that even the strike, whatever is successful, not successful, made it a business, right? I think if my parents ever were delusional that this was a family, as I think Mitzi perceived it, and my parents, it was no longer, which is fair enough if they're making money, you know, and, I think it evolved into a business. That's what happened in the 80s. It became show business. Like comedy was like, people go, "Oh, you grew up in show business." So it's like, well, I grew up in comedy. And yes, comedy evolved into show business, but it wasn't, right? Before that, it wasn't the business. Now it was a business. It was true business. And by the way, it sparked my whole career, right? Like I am in the business of show through comedy. That is my hub. It is always about stand-up first. And stand up into comedy, and then into different variations and incarnations of my career, doing different things with comedy, outside of stand up even. But yeah, and by the way, if I get too far off of the stand up hub and the comedy hub, I'm not as happy. Like I don't like agents normally who don't deal with stand-ups. And I don't even like some of the agents who do it because they make it too much in a business. And in my mind, I'm always like, let's call the manager. At least they have the whole, you know, whatever it is. But it's a business, and great on comics that they're, you know, can make a huge career, not just a living, but they're like arena rock stars now. There are comics, good or bad, whatever you think of their comedy, that is the piece of the business has evolved. So, you know, kind of it up in this time in the 80s where we got to like sit in the front row and like laugh at, everybody, the best, the best. And then it went down as things do, a boom and then a bust, and the economy in the 90s, and the Improv closed in New York. And then now it's built on another sort of foundation. And, hopefully we'll get back to it once we're done with these shenanigans.
So you mentioned agents. One of the reasons I was so hesitant was because I want people to like me. I mean,
me too.
I used to get like Rick Bernstein, who was my really best friend out there. The late Rick Bernstein was a great guy. Do you remember him at all?
I don't. Not
okay. He was a manager for a lot of the guys. He ended up managing Larry Miller, who I love.
Okay.
He said to me, Bruce, you're too nice a guy. And I basically said, don't say that, because you're wrong. I'm not too nice a guy. But really, I didn't want to be anything or anywhere where people didn't like. And people didn't like their agents because they could never do enough.
Yeah, right.
And so here I was kind of being pushed to be an agent, and no one will like me if I'm an agent. Yeah. But, it's what you said. I saw an incredible opportunity. It was right in front of my face. I hung around with everybody from Paul Reiser to Murray Langston to, Bobby Slayton. I mean, 35 guys, Larry Miller. No, I didn't get them all work. I've said it in one or two shows that I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have taken it seriously, but that whole agent stigma got to me, and I wanted to really be something else. So I never really got too dedicated to it, but I sure wish I did, because if I did, I'd probably be pretty much someplace in the comedy business right now.
Well, Bruce, I'm like you. People are like, well, why aren't you an agent? I was like, I don't want to. I mean, my career has been built on comedy, but and by the way, now, I understand, maybe you don't have to be friends with your agent, right? Maybe you want them to be an asshole because they're going to get you more money. I'm open to that possibility. It's not what I want to do, right? And I have the same thing. I want to be liked too. It's the best part of my personality and one of the worst parts of my, that kind of drive to, want to be the cool person. But yeah, I get that. I never, even a manager, people are like, you'd be a great manager because you see, and I go, again, I'm not manager better than agent, but I don't know.
So that brings up a super question for me.
Yeah.
Your dad, did he want to be liked, or he didn't really care all that much? Which one was it?
That's a good question. I want to ask him that point blank and see what he says, because he seems like somebody who is fine being not liked. He's had 8 million lawsuits that he walks with his head high and like Teflon. So clearly it's not at the core of that he cares that much. I think the truth is he cares if they're big stars.
I think I've heard that before.
Because he even said, I asked him, when I was making the documentary, I asked him, I interviewed him a lot, and I'd asked him about Jimmy J.J. Walker, Richard Pryor, because he has a feud with Jimmy Walker. He was Jimmy went to the Comedy Store and whatever, and I go,
Letterman, didn't he have that with Letterman too?
No, because Letterman was always Comedy Store.
Oh, okay.
Letterman was always Comedy Store. But I said, and as I was doing my research and I found out Richard Pryor was performing at the Comedy Store, I go, well, Richard Pryor moved to LA and he performed at the Comedy Store as well. And so did Jimmy. So why are you mad at Jimmy? He goes, well, Richard was a bigger star.
Great.
I go, okay, or somebody maybe bigger star, because Jimmy was a pretty big star at the time,
sure.
But as far as a stand-up, right? That's the thing, when I interviewed people for the documentary, I made a documentary when the Improv turned.
So tell us about it, because we've been
touching on it.
Bits and pieces, but I really want to know about it. So tell us.
So the Improv turned 50 in 2013. So 1963, it opened on 44th and 9th in New York. And I produced a documentary with my dad, with Mark Lano, with Judy Pastori for Epics. And and now it's been all around. You can find it on Amazon with free with ads. Check it out. It's 58 minutes.
I will.
It's a thank you, Bruce. I'm really proud of it. Oh, so I had asked, like, so the documentary, I was working on a personal, like, theatrical documentary, and I left around the 50th anniversary, and I left my job at Comedy Central to do it because I knew my parents, like, because they were divorced, there was no integrated story. I knew that my dad always did an anniversary special, which was more like performance oriented at the Improv. Like the 40th anniversary was on NBC, 20th was on Cinemax, I think. So I wanted to make a more heartfelt story about the Improv, about the origin story in '63, and I was working on it, and I tried to get a funding a little bit. It was early. It was before like Netflix was doing their own documentaries, and like now it's a very different documentary world. So I didn't get pre-funding, but I started to shoot anyway. And then my dad sold an anniversary special to Epix, but it happened to be a documentary as well. I'm not sure. He might have taken my treatment and sold it. But anyway, I became a producer on it. I got to sit down. I interviewed Jay Leno, Bill Maher, Jerry Seinfeld, Louis Black, Kathy Griffin, Russell Brand. I'm forgetting like heartfelt improv people. Anyway, a lot of people. I got to interview. Oh, Judd Apatow, Adam Sandler. It was great. It was like the highlight of 2013 for me and a life like of my career, like interviewing. Oh, Larry David, Richard Lewis. You know that story Glenn Hirsch told about when he went to the Improv and he didn't even know what existed. Like Larry told a similar story that in 1974, his friends from Long Island took him to the Improv. He didn't know what it was. They didn't know it was even a career possibility. And he's sitting there, and whoever was on stage made Larry David, and that space in New York was so super cramped. It was a crowded Friday night. It was like fucking wall-to-wall people. Stand up in the middle of the show, walk out to the bar, find my father and say, hey, I want to go up on stage. My father's like, are you a stand-up? He's like, well, no, but I think I can do it. He goes, no, there's a whole process and you have to audition. And, I mean, I love that moment for those moments of spark. Like it didn't matter that a show was going on. It didn't matter. He just saw it. And he jokes that his Jewish parents were ready to put their head in the oven. He was like a taxi cab driver. It was like he was so lost. He was so lost, and he was found. I mean, he was found at the Improv, and he said, like, I never met a group of people that were as terrible people as I am. Like your company you keep, And anyway, I love that story. But I asked
a Larry David story.
Oh yeah.
Remember where you were? I have a Larry David story.
Okay.
So I was in the runway before the big room. And there's the mirror on the left. And Larry came off stage into the runway, looked at that mirror and cursing. I mean, he had plenty of bad sets, I heard.
Oh, always, yeah. Always. He would yell at audience members. I interviewed Richard Lewis and Larry together and apart. And by the way, the best show, if I could ever produce a show, would be Larry and Richard together. They're like an old married couple. They talk about like Larry harassing people who got engaged, like and talking, and it doesn't matter. They're in the audience. I don't care that they're getting married. They're in the audience. They have to listen to. I mean, hysterical, right? You would never be able to put Larry David on stage unless there was somebody to back him up, because 9 out of 10 times he would march off stage. He would just be like fuck you all, I'm done. He's the greatest, and so funny, and what great success.
Nobody's bigger.
I mean it, right? And I'm, it's great that he found his spark, but I those moments, right? We all have had them, small, large, where you're like, get out of my way, everybody, I'm doing this. And that's what it was like, and then his story is that he couldn't come to the improv and audition. He had to practice. So he went to Catch a Rising Star, I think, to practice to get on the stage at the improv. And it was interesting what Glenn said, because I didn't know what the difference was. He said, like, the Comedy Store, not the Comedy Store, sorry. Catch a Rising Star was much more buttoned up, like the improv was a little looser. That might have been based on his relationship, but that might be true too. Obviously, I don't know. That was an interesting perspective. But Larry's like, I went and trained to get back to, the club or whatever, to the improv. I asked, so when I was doing the documentary, this is what I was going to say. It's like, I was originally going to do my own personal story about the beginning of the improv, but also my storyline as a child divorce. It turned into this hour-long, amazing hit parade of comedic stars talking about the improv, the origin story and continue, but a lot from 63. And I asked Seinfeld about my parents. I said, so just because that was kind of left over from, my ideas when I wanted to do the club. And I said, well, what was your relationship? He goes, well, Zoe, I'm kind of an aloof person. I'm not, he goes, Bette Midler, Robert Klein, they were looking for parents. Your parents might have been that kind of replacement. He's like, I was you've met me, I'm aloof. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, so, for me, that wasn't part of it. And I don't know if this is what I was to say, but I do think it's not untrue. Like, for him, it wasn't about my parents. It was about the space in New York club and the LA club. He loves both, but New York is where he started. He said the New York club was like where the Nile River met the Euphrates, like the birth of civilization. Yankee Stadium, like a lot of, metaphors for these significant things. But anyway, I asked about my parents. He's like, but I really do believe, this kind of loops back to what we were saying earlier, is that if my parents were different people, right? Like if they were people that were looking back and trying to keep the tidiness of the 50s. I know what I was to say. They, if they were closed-minded, shut down people, I don't think it would have evolved into what it was. But this is what I'm going to say. So Richard Pryor recorded a stand-up special in 1974 at the New York Improv called Alive and Smoking. And what I know is my parents don't agree on a ton, even till today, right? I always laugh when I find that intersectionality of opinion, and they both think Andy Warhol's a fraud. They both think like that has no value as an artist, and he was a fraud in the 60s and 70s. Richard Pryor and Andy Kaufman, right? Like those were the people they all agreed on. So Richard did a special, and he always talked about race. He was very revealing. He always talked about and I heard my parents, my dad especially, laughing on that sound, on the in the audience for the special. And I just know that my parents really loved comedy. They just did, I think that they were both, my dad more of a business person than my mom. My mom was that artist herself, not a stand-up, but a singer, and wanted to protect the artist in general. But like, they loved comedy. I think they wanted to do well. I think my dad, I think your question was, yes, that was the question, Bruce. We're coming full circle. Yay, did your father want to be liked?
No.
But I don't know why. There was something else. Like he didn't care about, but I loved Richard. I don't know. We went all over the place.
It's all good. By the way, tell me about your dad's health, because I know he's taken, you don't see too much about him. Thank God he's still with us. And
yeah. He's 88 years old.
Wow.
He lives here in Los Angeles. I see him a lot. He is healthy and with it and with us, lucid on this planet, which is great. He had a stroke in 2015. So life since then kind of has been a new normal. He is paralyzed mostly on the right side. Good thing he's left-handed. And so he is in a wheelchair most of the time. Certainly he has, he does physical therapy but primarily he is in a wheelchair. But his mind is still good, and he isn't always able to tell the story he wants to tell, like, because he can't pull the word, which is called aphasia, and it's post-stroke. And he's also 88. I mean, I have that at 53. Like, but he's good. And Alex, his wife, my stepmother, now of 40, almost 40 years, May.
Wow. And I certainly remember her. She
Yeah.
was a beautiful woman. and they were always together, and they
They
looked
love.
very happy. And look at that, they're still together.
Oh man, she is the best. She is Team Bud. She takes amazing care of them, of him, and their home. And he's lucky, despite he is in a wheelchair. He's healthy and he has the means to have somebody there also to help him, so he could go out. And I would joke that he would be still in the restaurants if we were allowed to eat out. He'd be inside. He wouldn't care. He loves eating out. He's a proud man. He goes out. He loves seeing people. He loves engaging. Life's different, but he's still that person.
Please say hello to him for me.
I always joke I said, Dad, it's hard on us extroverts. This pandemic is very hard on us extroverts. He goes, I know. I go, I know.
Make sure you say hello to him for me.
I definitely will. I'll probably see him now that we can't go to restaurants. Like he came last week to sit in my backyard. We had lunch. We did barbecued. So we do what we can. I'm going to take him out to the beach. I found a place that has those sand wheelchairs. And I'm going to take him out to the beach next week.
So important.
Yeah. But he gets around. Yeah. I really do believe, again, my parents, my dad more than my mother was a business person but they both loved stand-up and they both loved stand-ups. It is true that, there are, and I think Mitzi, sure, also, I think people who did get into it in the early days do. I think there are people later on got into it for business only, which is fine too. I mean, whatever, it's a business. Again, as we were talking about, it's a business.
Someone said to me, Gilbert Gottfried has a podcast. And I said, oh, okay. So I listened the other day. He was howling in laughter. And I realized how much comedians love to laugh too. He was howling the whole show. He had on an older comedic guy, and he was just howling. And I said, wow, comedians really do love to laugh. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing.
It is. Laughter is so important. For comedians need it. We all need it. It's a connectivity. It's, and not to segue to my charity, but I will say that
I do want to talk about that, please.
It was a very genuine thing about the transformational power of laughter, right? That's kind of how it started. And by the way, it was at the LA Improv on Melrose in 2011. I was there because I was there a lot. I would scout or, produce or go to showcases, see who's the hot new comic for my, producing career, whatever. And two women in the comedy business who I know, and I would see at the Improv a lot, came up to me and said, do you think we could change the world through comedy? And I was like, I think about this all the time. And, just get me started and I want to talk about stand-up. It's yeah, because I know for me, it's my health, it's my wealth, it's my hobby, it's my connectivity. I met my husband do stand-up, even though he's not a stand-up. It is obviously everything in my life. I was born into it. And we started a company called Comedy Gives Back at the time. And what we did is we partnered with different charities like Malaria No More or the Haiti Water Project when they had the earthquake. And we would produce a stand-up comedy night. Now, comedy and charity have gone hand in hand for a long time. And then we would live stream it. We added the digital technology piece to it. And it was great. And comics would say yes, because for a whole bunch of reasons. One is because one of three of us, my two partners are Amber J. Lawson and Jody Lieberman, would have given them maybe a job early in their careers, or or I gave, whatever, or they just want a good audience, and fundraisers tend to have good, so whatever. It was a whole reason why comics would say yes to it. And we were always so appreciative, raising money for causes that didn't affect them, really. And then in 2018, a comedian named Mo Mandel made a joke in Montreal at the comedy festival saying, with a bunch of other comics around, hanging out with me, and a bunch of comics said, hey, if you ever want to do a free comedy show, hang out with her, me. And I laughed because I was like, oh yeah, I guess it is like free labor. I said, but it's for good cause. And I said to my partners, I said, every comic says yes to us if they're around and available, but who's taking care of the comics? The stand-ups live a really hard life. They're, paycheck to paycheck on the road. I mean,
imagine the older ones my age right now.
That's right. Who maybe are working on cruise ships, and then they get aged out of that, or pandemic happens and their cruise ships stop running, right? So we kind of had that kind of aha moment. That's going to be, and then you look around, you go, oh my God, actors have Actors Fund, musicians have music cares, and stand-ups have nothing. How dare us? Shame on us as a community that we didn't have this. So we started talking about it. Like I would go out to lunch, like with, Dave Becky or Dave Rath, who are managers of comedians and used to work at the Improv, right? Talking about that improv hub of like, and now they're very powerful, big comedy managers. And they're like, we wanted to do something like that. And we got somebody from Music Cares on our board and we figured out how to do it. And we were ready to launch very similar to what Music Cares does. Like, hey, I'm a road comic and my car broke down and I have a big tour booked, again, pre-pandemic, big tour booked, and if I don't get it, I won't be able to pay my rent. How much your car? $2,000. We write a check to the mechanic. They have their car. Wow. My tooth fell out. I have an audition. I need a tooth, So we started like working with Music Cares, got our whole thing processed, in order. And then pandemic hit. So we were ready to open up these funds. And all of a sudden in March 13th, everything changed. And by April 4th, we did Laugh Aid, which was a live stream digital telethon, back to that model, raising money for Comedy Is Back. Here's our poster from it. We had 90 comedians, Bruce, say yes.
Wow.
To being on. So we had Howie, you talked about Howie Mandel, Bob Saget, Tom Papa, Adam Sandler, Whitney Cummings, Burt Kreischer, Bill Burr,
wow.
Paul Scheer, Jeff Ross. I mean, the list goes, 90 comedians said yes. It was 8 hours long.
Wow.
And we raised $500,000.
Wow.
And on April 5th, we started giving grants to stand-up comedians in need. The grants are $500. It's not totally life-changing, but I will say that the feedback we get from the comedians we help is like, this $500 feels like $5 million when I see Adam Sandler, Bob Saget, Jeff Ross, all volunteer their time for me. It amplifies $500.
Good for you. Wow.
We started weekly gatherings for comedians to help them. How do I apply for unemployment? How do you get Uncovered California? Wow. How do you do social media? So we try, and it's kind of these Zoom gatherings every Thursday. We just got a generous donation from Netflix to launch a BIPOC comedian emergency relief fund.
Wow.
So, my parents were big comedy charity people, helping comics, but also using comedy for this and to raise money for things. And this feels like my legacy. This feels like the natural extension of what my parents started. I feel we have to protect comics. They are not considered artists with a big A, and they need to be. And stand-up is like one of the few American art forms because we have freedom of speech. And we used to anyhow, it was fairly protected, and they need to be protected. They're a national resource, and we want to have an old age home.
Absolutely. Wow.
So we have plans. We know we've been around just a year or year and a half in this form, but we're excited and we're ready we're doing the work,
If there's some way that I can be a part of I don't want to call it old age home, but if there's some way I could be a part of that, I'm going to stay in touch with you because I
love that.
have so much respect for you and what you're doing and the person you have turned out to be against all odds.
A lot of therapy. People go, what's the difference between you and Pauly Shore? I go, therapy, I think. I don't know.
Oh, that's right. That is so funny. I could go on. We can go on.
This is so much fun,
day.
Isn't it?
I know you can't stay with me all day. And, people are going to just love what we put together here today. So I want to thank you so much for being with me. I loved it. I hope you enjoyed it also.
I love this so much. I was worried, right? I was worried, like, what is my memory? And I know it didn't have to be the 80s solely because there's a lot before and after, right? But I was like, because I was this kid and what do I remember? And, things come up. So it's so much fun to also be back at that place and remember there's that great picture, and I'm going to try to find it, with the club, and I think it was hanging at the Hollywood Improv for a while. It's that bar area all crowded. And if you really, it's like, where's Waldo? Oh, there's Jay Leno. There's Larry Miller. There's Paul. And it's this, and it was an amazing time. And I will tell you, I know the Comedy Store is having their heyday, you know, like now, again, pre-pandemic, a lot of comics, oh, it's I go there. It's still gross and scary and dark, although it's a fun night out, and you know, it's kind of taboo when I get to go, so it's dangerous living on, you know.
But when you walk into the Improv.
But when I walk into the Improv, there's nothing better. There's nothing that makes me feel more comfortable. And it's still a great club that, and what I love, you know, the Improv was sold, right? Like, so Bud and Mark last year, wow, they got out just in time.
Oh, wow.
So good on them. But they've left it in the hands of Levity, which is a company who I consult with as well. What they really want to do, which I love, is retain the history. They didn't buy the Improv to make it a comedy club without its past. They want to honor it. They revere that time so much.
Wow.
And they even have the round table
in
down
the corner?
Not in
under the stairs?
No, on the other side towards the windows.
Oh, okay.
Because under the stairs are banquettes now. They've changed it a little bit.
Oh, okay.
So it's like more of a like narrow table. So it's in the corner towards the windows. And I sit there when I go sometimes, and then, you know, with a group of people, and I mean, certainly it's not the same heyday like of my father holding court there, but I certainly think about it. And my dad still loves round tables at restaurants, by the way. You know, he likes being able to see and hear and talk to everybody. But I would say Levity has done a good job of retaining the history. I think they know they cleaned it up too much. They want to make it, you know, and they want to make, they're the first club to do Yonder. I don't know if you know what that is. They're these little sacks where you put your phone. So you walk in and you can't have your phone accessible to you in the showroom,
Good.
Which is awesome. And although it is nerve-wracking when you're like, what do you want me to do? So they give you these sacks, you ask to turn it off, you put it in, it's locked. You can hold on to it. So no, you know, it's not like you're checking your phone. And when you go out, if you need to check your phone or get on the phone or check your text, they open it on your, you know, open when you go out of the showroom and you can use it. And because they care about comedy and they care that comics don't like, because look what happened to Michael Richards. Not only are people distracted, but people are also, you know, it's not safe, right? It's become so I really appreciate all the steps they've taken to try to keep it a human thing, not a corporation, because it's a big corporation that owns it now, right? But to keep it feeling homey and the memory of Bud and Mark, and then, you know, the Improv before that, you know, they really honor it. And that to me makes me feel good. They're not trying to disregard it. And yeah, it's still a pretty great place.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. I went out there in '93 to visit, and it was after the riot, after the earthquake, after the everything. And it was so dead. I was like, oh my God.
The 90s were bad. I mean, the 90s were bad. The Improv in New York closed in '93. Like, it's, that was really rough. And look, you know, it goes up and down, live comedy, you know, showcase comedy, but they do okay. It's not as dead. It's probably not what it was in the '80s, but they take good care of it.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that.
But you have to come out, Bruce, after this is all done. We'll have a reunion of sorts. Because, by the way, I was looking at photos this morning, right? And so Jim.
By the way, Zoe has said, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Zoe.
Yeah.
I'm going to scan these pictures and find other ones, and I'm going to put them on the website.
Yeah, we're going to do that. But I wanted to say that what's so sad is I was looking at a photo this morning, and it was my mom, George Carlin, Uncle Dirty, and Jim DeMetropolis, and Jim was basically the archivist of the club. I would say 80% of photos, both in LA and New York, were from Jim. He called himself my godfather. I don't think I had it anyway. And I cried. My husband was like, like, just because 3 out of 4 people were dead in that photo.
Oh,
You
and
know?
by the way, you're married and have a child and have a teenage son?
Yes, teenage son named Gibson. Yep. But I want to say, like, we all need to do it now because we're not getting any younger.
Exactly.
And I didn't mean to like bring it down with everybody being dead, but what I'm saying is there's still enough of us around. I was trying to find
Absolutely.
to
That's
do
why
it.
I'm doing what I'm doing here, because I want to record it. I don't want this to ever go away.
Yeah, no, me neither. Me neither. And that's, I mean, check out, if you haven't checked out the doc, it's a lot of fun. It's not quite as in-depth as I wanted, but it turned, I was proud of it nonetheless. And it is a bit of a history lesson, but fun, you know, great names and great, you know, great talent talking about the spark when it happened. You know, it was really good. So Bruce, this was so much fun.
Hey, listen, I can't thank you enough. First of all, I'm so proud of you.
I have the best babysitters in the biz, a lot of them.
Yes.
You included, the Bruces in LA.
Yes, yes. You know, we looked out for you. Some of us fully and some of us out of the corner of our eyes. And
Totally.
I just loved the relationship that we had. Not that it was not anything like Kevin Nealon or Bruce Smirnoff, but I thought you were a great kid. And look what a beautiful adult you've turned into. And I couldn't be happier to put this, for you to say thank you to do this show with me.
Oh, it is my pleasure. And it's strange because you feel as alive and vital of a memory than of a Nealon of that time, right? Like it resonates. Like you're like, do you remember? It's like, of course. I couldn't tell you. I didn't know what you did. Perhaps you were stand-up. I was just a kid, but you're very viscerally part of that memory for me. And the question you asked me, which I love, is who let you into the world? I mean, you did, and Bruce Smirnoff and Kevin. I'm going to think about that. I love that question. That is a really interesting kind of thing. Like, who let me in? And what does that mean?
A lot of the guys were standoffish and, like, you know, heady, and Larry David was just so heady. And you said Jerry. One more quick Jerry story. Yeah. You know, during those days, we used to sit around and say, we should just do a comedy, like a story about stand-ups and not really about anything else. Like, what went on behind the scenes with stand-ups, and that would be funny. Like what went on behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And you know, then we have Seinfeld.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
God bless, Zoe, and we'll be in touch. I know we will. Thank you so much for your time. This was a great show. You're watching the Bruce Starr Show. Thank you for being with us, and more in the future. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks.